AI is changing software development fast, and as good as some of those changes are, there are some that are bad and interesting and worth talking about. One of those changes is the role of the library. I've been thinking about this a lot because I build a lot of things and I build them using a lot of different libraries. I've even been memed on it consistently for just npm installing away my problems. And to be fair, that is a real thing that we've seen in ecosystems like npm. The fact that you can just npm install something as simple as a way to pad text on the left is a bit weird. On one hand, it's cool that these things that are reusable and common can be shared in such a convenient way, but on the other, it definitely made us a bit lazier because we could just grab a solution that we barely understand and plug it into our code. Kind of like we're doing with AI. Weird. Huh. I wonder how these things will go together. Well, I'm not just wondering, I'm living it myself. I've been changing a lot of things in the projects that I work in, including things like removing libraries that no longer really make sense or cause us problems. And I'm finding that more often than not, depending on the size of the library, it's actually more convenient to just rip it out and rewrite it using prompts than it is to try and massage around the library to try and patch it or work around its weird traits. In this case, there was a library called Takumi that we used for rendering React components on the server to generate PNGs for the T3 chat wrapped feature. And for some reason, we could not get it to bundle in production at all. And I kept fighting it for like 15 minutes, got annoyed, and just vibe code rewrote the whole thing to be client-side JavaScript instead. And I'm far from the only person doing this. Antirez, the creator of Redis, yes, that Redis, is starting to gut C++ libraries in favor of rewritten, vibe-coded pure C implementations. This PR removes 4,000 lines of code and only adds 400. And as he says in the description, this code was written by Claude Code using Opus 4.5 and tested carefully, both hand-tested and tested against the original implementation in a synthetic way. Code review was performed independently by Codex and ChatGPT 5.2. Very interesting to see. And I have a feeling this trend is not just going to continue, but is going to fundamentally change the way that our projects look, and most importantly, the way that our package JSONs look. It seems like we're quickly entering a world where these libraries are no longer anywhere near as useful. But you know what is useful? Today's sponsor. I'm a big advocate for not wasting my teammates' time, which is why I think it's really important to use a good AI tool to help you with code review. Even if you're not using AI to code, it is a really helpful thing to have an AI check your work, which is why CodeRabbit has been making my team move so much faster. We've had it on for about a year now, and my team won't let me turn it off or move to anything else. They just really, really like it. For the quality of the reviews, for the types of things that it catches, for how tunable it is just by telling it, hey, I don't like that thing. But honestly, I'm getting more hyped about CodeRabbit because of all the other cool stuff you can do with it. Recently, I've been loving their CLI. Yes, a vibe coding, reviewing CLI. Think Claude Code, but for telling you what you did wrong. Sounds crazy until you combine it with Claude Code. Yes, really. All these agentic coding tools can use Bash. So if you give them a tool to review their code and tell it to use that, it can output plain text that the CLI can then use to fix things. And this does actually increase the quality of the output. I can't tell you how many times I was running into the same loop before where I would make an agent make changes, put up the pull request, wait for a review from an AI code reviewer, and then have to copy paste the feedback back into my agent. This lets you trim that out entirely and just get better code out as soon as you ship. It also integrates in your IDE, VS Code, Windsurf, Cursor, and more. It's kind of crazy to make changes on your computer and just have a little thing pop up saying, hey, are you sure about that? That doesn't seem safe. It saves me so much time and has prevented many actual bugs and outages from shipping on T3 chat. Try it free today at soydev.link/coderabbit. This is going to be an interesting one because I found that there are a couple different archetypes of people that have opinions on this. Like, think of the type of person that makes fun of JavaScript developers all of the time for installing things like is odd or leftpad. The people who are against these packages have a real point. It's outsourcing some level of competency. Anyone should be able to write the 3-line of code function to pad things on a string on the left of it, and is odd is literally 1 line of code. Like, we're better than this. That said, there is value in libraries, at least at a slightly bigger size than these ones. I am tired of the meme here. And the arguments against libraries like this all make sense. Like, outsourcing your dependencies this way is a risk because now you have to worry about if the dependency changes, maybe somebody takes over the package and is malicious and publishes a bad change. Maybe there's a major version that breaks the way you're using it. Maybe you have all of these things installed and now this huge dependency chain is making it way harder to know what is or isn't safe in your app. There's a lot of things like this. For the most part, the argument against these libraries is that people who don't really know what they're doing are the users, and they also don't understand the risk they're taking on when supply chain attacks can happen, when dependencies can change, just all the things that could go wrong when your package JSON looks like a glossary of NPM. And I've seen projects like this. I've seen plenty of projects that look like they just NPM install whatever the hell is in front of them, rather than actually trying to solve problems themselves. What's always been interesting to me is the people who complain about these things tend to also complain about AI code, which is weird because in many ways, AI code is kind of the solution to this problem. The reason people reach for libraries as, to be frank, pathetic as is-odd or leftpad is because they don't know what they're doing, thereby they are increasing risk in their code base to get over the fact that they don't know what they're doing. And things like generating AI code instead, or tab completing the function, or just asking the chat next to your code in the interface for help doing this thing, those are much less likely to have those same problems. Would it be better to just write the code yourself? Maybe. Probably. At the very least, understanding the code is important. But if you look at the things that are wrong with stuff like these packages, the classic supply chain attack stuff, the fact that it's not in your code base, so anything that goes wrong with it or doesn't perform exactly as you expect it to is now a problem that you have to deal with. And of course, you don't actually understand it. These are all real problems, and we are able to eliminate multiple of these simply by generating the code ourselves instead. So for these smaller scale libraries, yes, people probably shouldn't have been using them in the first place, but AI as a way to eliminate them from the lives of less capable devs that don't actually know what they're doing, the stereotypical person who would install is odd, AI code is a net win for them. It will also make it harder to tell that they are as bad as they are, which has its own benefits and negatives. But at the very least, AI replacing these types of things is a good thing, and people relying on packages instead of the 2 lines of code they should write themselves is not great. Moving this off is cool. But then there are lots of other libraries that are quite a bit more annoying to deal with, doing things that are tough. Things like Takumi, for example, or FastFloat in C++. These libraries are in Rust and C++, respectively. Takumi is actually a really cool project. It makes a ton of sense for a lot of things. Takumi is, as they say here, it's a JSX to image. It's a fast way to do rendering of React components so that you get an image out. Really cool if you want to programmatically generate images like this or like this. It's very cool. Problem is, the bindings just were not playing nice with our deployments on any platform, especially on Vercel. I spent a lot of time trying to fix it. Whenever we shipped, it would build fine, but it would error out all of our instances, and our production instance for T3 chat went down for about 25 seconds when this officially shipped for us. So I immediately reverted the ship and went and fought it a whole bunch privately and concluded that I didn't feel like it, and it was easier for me to work around the problem by vibe coding my own solution. To be fair here, I also have built things like this before that render React in the browser, snapshot it to a canvas, and then let you download the image. It's not something I'm unfamiliar with, but this library was the better solution. Moving off of this was a downgrade in terms of the capabilities of the system, the performance, and the fact that we moved this to the client instead of doing it on the server like we had previously wanted to. It also meant that if you share a link to your wrapped, that we wouldn't have the image there. The image had to be generated on client. So it had its compromises. But as a developer that understood these things, I could make that decision up myself. I thought about it thoroughly. I looked at the problems we were having. I looked at the things that were going wrong, and I concluded that it wasn't worth it for the benefits we got when I could instead build my own solution. I ended up having to spend a lot of time going back and forth and editing a lot of the code myself, because once you get into weird canvas rasterization stuff, the usefulness of AI agents can go down quite a bit. I tried everything with this, and they could all get a vague React rendering in a box that could be turned into a picture, mostly right. But once it came to things like spacing, word wrapping, general layout stuff, and especially like the aesthetics we wanted to add behind the cards, it failed super hard for all of that. And it is my understanding that FastFloat came from a similar place from our friend Antirez. His goal here was to remove one of the few C++ dependencies that is required for building Redis. This is in order to simplify the build process. Funny. Not far from what I'm dealing with. It turns out that bringing in other people's code and expecting it to operate in your code base the same way your code does is not realistic. And it's one of the problems that we often deal with our environments. This is why tools like Webpack are still around in 2026, because as frustrating and annoying as they are to work with, there are often dependencies that companies are building on and around that expect tools like Webpack to work a certain way so that you could integrate them into your code base a certain way. A tool like this FastFloat dep is expecting G++ to be installed. Sadly, a lot of Linux distributions don't have that installed even when you set up basic build tools, which means that Redis can't be built on those machines until you manually set up G++. Previously, that made sense because writing a float library was annoying and difficult, and rewriting it in C was even more annoying and more difficult. It's just this type of tedious thing that is what we reached to libraries for. And I want to put these libraries in different categories. There's libraries that go beyond your knowledge. This is, for people who don't know what they're doing, this is stuff like is-odd or leftpad. For people who do know what they're doing, but maybe just don't want to fight it, for me, that's something like Takumi. I didn't want to write Rust code to render things on the back end. Not interesting to me. But what it does was within my knowledge. So there's certain libraries you're using because what they're building is beyond your knowledge. And to be clear, I want to categorize this primarily as a thing that happens to more beginner devs. But then there is libraries you use because re-implementing it your way would be tedious. There are a lot of things that fall into this. For me, I still don't like writing my own state management libraries in my React projects because as much as I have opinions about state, all of the little things you have to get right are frustrating, and I will always prefer to work with an existing solution, especially since so many of them are so extensible, so rock solid, and so performant. There's another piece to consider here. Maintenance and extensibility. You can build things in a way that you'll maintain them yourselves and they'll be very extensible, but the chances you do that are very low. So if you need a really powerful tool to handle whatever you throw at it in the future, like let's say you're building an application for the web, and in the future you want to add login, you want to add a blog, you want to add sessions that can be invalidated more easily, you want to add better SEO through server rendering, all those types of things. Maybe you build the app yourself using vanilla React, or you build your own frameworks to build around this. Or you can use a tool like Next.js, which has decades of work put into it in order to make all of those pieces more likely to be there when you need them. Have I regretted picking Next for projects in the past? Absolutely. But did I regret it because it was missing functionality that I needed? No. Next.js as a platform was very welcoming to all the weird things I wanted to do to it, whereas now that I'm building more things with traditional Vite plus React, I don't have the ability to server render the pages that I do want to, which is very frustrating when I do want some SEO on certain places, or I want to have static rendering for pages like my docs page, or maybe for my blog, or the terms of service on a site that I'm building. That stuff is obnoxious to get right. And having a tool like Next.js that allows us to go in whatever direction we want to is really powerful. When I put Next.js in here, am I saying that I fully understand every detail of how it works and I could build it myself if it wasn't so tedious? No. But the things I'm using in a given project, I probably could do that for. So Next.js is still the type of dep that would make sense for a lot of my projects. That said, there's a lot that it doesn't make sense for, and I'm much more likely to throw together my own solution now than I ever was in the past. Things that were too tedious to implement ourselves suddenly make way more sense, though, and this is where things get interesting. Let's try to chart this out with complexity versus your capability. Here's something like is-odd. It's obviously as little complexity as possible. So who would ever possibly use this? Well, somebody who's just learning how to code, like a true beginner, could absolutely see themselves using something like is-odd because their capability is relatively low and this library is relatively appetizing, as stupid as the problem it is that it solves. So somebody who doesn't really know what they're doing, reaching for this, makes sense. So the way I'm thinking of this is that on this section, these are things you would pull in code or deps for. And down here is things you wouldn't dare do that for. Because as your capability goes up, your willingness to adopt some external solution to a problem goes down based on, again, how complex the problem is. If I have something as complex as synchronizing data across client and server, I might foolishly think I can build that myself, which I did with Theo's awful sync engine that used to power T3 chat. I thought I could do that myself and that the solutions that existed just weren't worth the adoption cost. So I tried this myself and I went to hell for it. So now I use Convex, which is an external solution. It is a service, it is a framework, it is a library, it is a lot of things, but it is effectively a database as well as a compute platform for updating things in the database. So now that I've experienced this problem, my willingness to adopt Convex has gone up a ton. And there are other benefits too, that Convex, by living in my code base as actual source code, makes it much easier for these same AI tools to make changes. I know, hardcore Convex shill, sorry, I love this project so much, and there's a reason that it comes up a lot. It really, really helps in this new world. So what's very interesting here is I feel like this has bent out a ton. Instead of this being such a simple linear line, the willingness to pull in depths has changed fundamentally. Why would I pull in a dep when I could use the dependency as a reference point that I could then prompt an agent to go build? And this is where things are going to start getting really interesting, in my opinion. An idea I've been thinking a lot about is this quote from Pete, who I've talked about in almost all my videos recently. Pete's building a ton of cool open source stuff using agents. This stuff's getting adopted more and more, which means he has to review more and more PRs and requests, issues, all of these types of things. Here's his quote. "I don't like pull requests anymore. A large chunk of code change doesn't tell me much about the intent or why it was done. I now prefer prompt requests. Just share the prompt you ran or want to run. If I think it's good, I'll run it myself and merge it." This is an idea that's so crazy, I'm probably going to do a dedicated video on just it, but it also shows a lot of what I'm talking about here. Instead of seeing a library and immediately npm installing it, what if you see the library and the developer experience it provides, and then you tell an agent to implement something like it in your code base? And instead of just blindly installing Zustand, which I love and will continue to install, especially because its bundle size is so small and it's very well documented and agents understand it well. But hypothetically speaking, if I liked this, but didn't want to use the package, or I wanted something that only included parts of it, like I really want this, but I don't want the rest, I can copy this, hop into my terminal or into whatever other tool I use, paste it in and say, make this work this way. Don't bring in any depths, and it will implement the parts that I want. This is one of the harshest realities when you bring in a library. There's a very, very good chance the library does a hell of a lot more than you want it to. Funny enough, it's one of the benefits of these tiny ones like Izod and LeftPad. These don't do jack shit. But libraries like this probably bring a lot of things in that you don't want. And then libraries like Next are definitely bringing in a lot of things that you probably don't want or need. And this is now a calculation that has fundamentally changed in our heads. Previously, the math was pretty simple. You multiplied how hard the problem was with how bad you need a solution to it, with how risky it was to adopt that external solution. This math's gotten all wonky now because the risk now feels much greater because any library, especially after all the NPM exploits and things, every additional dep in your dependency list feels scarier now. How hard as this has gone down because it's easier to implement, and how badly do we need it hasn't really changed. But it feels like how hard has gone down and the perceived risk has gone up. This makes the math work out very, very differently than it used to. I'm not the only one saying this. There have been a couple articles from both Simon and Jeffrey about how libraries are kind of dead now. There's the classic meme as old as time, all modern infrastructure versus a project some random guy in Nebraska has been thanklessly maintaining since 2003. And to be very, very clear, you're not going to vibe code an alternative to FFmpeg. That is an incredible library that is going to power things indefinitely into the future. Open source by design is not financially sustainable. Finding reliable, well-defined funding sources is exceptionally challenging. As projects grow in size, many maintainers burn out and find themselves unable to meet the increasing demands for support and maintenance. What's funny here is this is getting even worse as a result of AI. AI makes it easier to implement these things yourself, but it also means a lot of less experienced people are coming into the field and are adopting these things. I would guess, I'll go check, but I would honestly guess these libraries are probably being installed more than ever, not less than ever, simply because of the popularity of coding going up as a result of these AI tools. Let's see if my theory here is right. Izod has maintained roughly where it was, but it is going back up now after the Christmas slump. Yeah, downloads have not gone down, even though the need to install this has gone down because you can just vibe code an alternative, or hopefully you're competent enough to know the one line of code you want instead. LeftPad people love downloading as a meme, so it will always have these weird spikes. But as you see here, the amount of actual downloads does indeed appear to be going up over time, which is weird and scary. But again, that's because people are writing more stuff than they ever have before. What's even funnier in the case of LeftPad is that this is now built into JavaScript. There is a concept of adding padding as a string function that's built in, and people are still installing this. But when you have enough more people who are building stuff using AI that don't know what they're doing, the likelihood they install something like this is also going up as a result. So I think it's important to think about when you're adopting libraries is how much you can shift it because you don't control it. Remember, a library is a bundle of code that lives somewhere else that you're effectively pulling into your project. This is one of the biggest benefits of vibe coding alternatives because you can now shift them in different directions when they don't do what you need. So you have to think when you adopt this thing, can you influence it? Like, can you change how it works? And if you do need something, can you convince people to make those shifts for you? If no, you're just a user of the thing. If yes, we have more questions. Do you have the capacity to contribute? Do you have the time to go into this project, make changes, file pull requests the way the team wants, and communicate with them to get them actually merged and shipped? If no, you're a backer. You're just maybe contributing money to it, but that's about it. If yes, we have one more question. Strategic importance. How important is it for this thing to be part of your project, to work certain ways? How important is this to your business and what you're building? If yes, you need to be a maintainer. If no, you need to be a contributor. Roughly, yes. But if you could throw this whole thing away by just forking or building an alternative, the value proposition changes a lot. One fun example of this is Ink. Almost all of the coding CLIs we are using right now originally started based on top of Ink. So what is Ink? Ink is React for CLIs. It lets you write CLIs using React components by providing a bunch of primitives as a library. Kind of how React Native works, where it provides components that let you render to native platforms. Ink provides components that let you render to the CLI. I still use this for a lot of the command line apps that I'm vibe coding because AI tools know React very well, and this library is well documented enough and used enough that people seem to understand it too. And to go back to NPM trends, we can take a look at how popular Ink is and see very clearly that it has skyrocketed in popularity, largely due to these new tools. Ink is really cool. That said, Ink has plenty of problems of its own. The classic flicker problem that exists in tools like Claude Code and is starting to finally be resolved is largely blamed on Ink. The harsh reality is that Ink isn't the problem there. There's a whole world to go into here of the different rendering modes in the terminal using the standard built-in buffer versus the alternative buffer. And that's where a lot of the UX differences come between a tool like Claude Code and Codex versus a tool like what you see with OpenCode. OpenCode isn't using the standard buffer, so it's not going to behave the same way your terminal does, and they have to re-implement all of those things. That is why these things are so different. That said, Ink is really powerful, but it has its limitations around the way it uses the buffer, around performance expectations, around a lot of the assumptions that it has, and most importantly, the fact that it's just one dude building it part-time who is busy defending his country from another country. I have the utmost respect for Vadim, and I totally understand why he can't be making changes to this project constantly, especially considering how many multi-billion-dollar companies are leaning on it as heavily as they are. That's why Sindre's largely taken over the project. Sindre's built a ton of awesome shit, including Kai, which is one of my favorite fetch alternatives in JavaScript, and one of those things that I was starting to install more that I now rip. I should sponsor him. I will do that after stream. You should too. They are working really hard to maintain this library, especially now that it is more essential than ever. That said, certain companies that don't necessarily believe as much in open source that are relying on this heavily, Claude, Anthropic, sorry, I've been sick for a bit, decided that rather than contribute to this library or do an open source fork that fixes their problems, they've instead decided to just internally, privately rewrite it. And now Claude Code is using their internal alternative to Ink that is closed source and private because it's cheaper to do things that way. And that's really what it comes down to. To go back to this chart, Anthropic decided that while they kind of have the capacity to contribute, they don't feel like doing it, but they didn't like landing on the backer space, so they decided to just build it themselves. And now with Claude Code internally, it's way easier for them to build and maintain that, which is a big part of why they do it. Their willingness to fork dependencies and internally maintain alternatives is a lot higher because it's easier to do that. This is also why they chose to buy Bun, because unlike the Ink dependency, Bun is probably not something you can vibe code your way around. I know that Jared is using Claude Code to make a lot of changes to Bun now, but that is with a lot of effort. And Bun is becoming more and more a core dependency of Claude Code as they're trying to ship binaries that are native single packages that could be easily installed across platforms. Bun has become more and more core to how the project works. One way of thinking of this is, what is the relationship between the library and your project? This is your project, and the library that you're using is some small part inside of it, like, I don't know, LeftPad. Maybe that library is not something that you should have as a library, because what you're doing when this is a library is effectively taking this thing that isn't yours and linking it in as a virtual project inside, because you don't have the code, you just have the package. So for things like this, or in the case that we're talking about here, Ink, If you can't change this thing because it comes in through a package, your decision to kill all of this so that you can own it makes sense. But if the dependency we're talking about is a little higher level, like, this, I would argue bun effectively wraps Claude Code, the project, in a literal sense, because bun is how they bundle it, how they build it, how they create the binary for it. It's also where all of Claude Code's code runs. Claude Code is a JavaScript project that has a bunch of dependencies that run inside of bun. Bun is a higher level external dep in this case. So bun being something that they acquire and maintain makes much more sense, because if they want to reduce the risk of all of their dependencies, the one that wraps everything is scary, and they should probably try to find some way to maintain it. It makes sense that bun was acquired by Anthropic when you consider the nature of how bun works within their projects and their work. Whereas Ink, they see as easier to just rewrite. And here's the harsh reality. We all need to change how we think of it. It's a very strange world that we're living in now. Anthropic is one of the first to realize this and do the math and decide Ink is worth forking, bun is worth buying. We all need to think about this ourselves. Which projects are worth forking, are worth building our own alternatives to, are worth funding and contributing to, or are worth avoiding because of the risk profile. The way that we measure which projects we rely on and which packages and libraries and tools we build on top of is fundamentally changing right now. And it's important that you go through your dependencies and think about this. Is this library necessary? Is it holding us back? This is also why I love projects like shadcn, because shadcn doesn't encourage you to install a bunch of NPM packages that you don't have any control of. It did used to encourage you installing a ton of the Radix packages, but even they are now burnt by that and are starting to move to base UI. What's cool with shadcn is when you set up shadcn, it is doing such by copy pasting all of that stuff into your code base directly. Shadcn creates a folder named components where all of the files are there. On the topic of having the code in your code base, turns out AI is way better at going through code bases than it is at trying to find things through hellish, unorganized docs, LLMs text files, and crappy MCPs that load way too many tokens into your apps. Ben, my channel manager and also fellow YouTuber, built this app, BTCA, which will, instead of doing that, clone the whole code base and use the built-in tools in your agent tooling, things like grep and other search tools, to find how this code works. This ends up being way more reliable than the classic MCP solution like Context 7 that is trying to index all of the data in the docs. Yeah, BTCA is way more reliable because it actually understands the code because it has the real code. It turns out these AI tools are way better at dealing with code than they are at dealing with poorly formatted documentation. So when the code lives in your project, that's going to be much better than a bunch of old, outdated Stack Overflow threads that don't actually understand how things work. But do you know what's better than better context? Just having the context in your code base directly. The value of having your code inside of the repo, inside of the place where your agents are already operating, is higher than it's ever been, which greatly increases the incentive to pull things in. It's part of why shadcn is doing as well as it is right now. It's why more and more people are starting to do changes like this and use tools like BTCA or drop external libraries where they can entirely. There's been a ton of progress in this space. I like Simon Willison's thoughts on this too. He specifically says that a lot of his open source projects solve existing problems that are frustratingly hard to figure out. He also built Django, the Python framework, so he has experience here. He built his S3 credentials package specifically because getting read-only and read-write credentials for S3 buckets was annoying. Shout out upload thing, by the way. That's a big part of why we made it. Getting S3 right is obnoxious. And instead of having to figure out how to do all of this properly through IAM policies, he built a package to make it easier. But now modern LLMs are very good at those same policies to the point that if he needs to solve the problem today, he doubts he would find it frustrating enough to justify finding or creating a library to do it. And I'm seeing this too. I can't tell you how many times I've shared something I'm working on and a bunch of people say, why don't you release it? Where's the code? And I'll instead just send them the prompt and then they go at it themselves. I no longer want source code. I want prompts. I want examples of how they're using the thing. I want to know what the value is and why they made it so I can then go make my own equivalent. There are lots of projects that you can't do in 1 to 10 prompts, but there are a lot of things you can. A lot of dependencies that are so well understood, so well documented, and so common that replacing them with your own code suddenly makes a lot of sense. It's kind of crazy when you think about it. Previously, the thing that made a library really useful was that the problem was annoying, the solution was simple, and the package was popular, universal, maintained. This is roughly what would make one of those packages worth installing. These exact same characteristics make it really easy to solve with AI. If the problem is annoying, chances are there's a lot of public documentation on the problem. If the solution is simple, there's probably a lot of documentation of that solution that the agents have in their training data. And if the package is universal, popular, and well-maintained, there's a very good chance the agents and the LLMs we're using have it all in their training data and can replicate it meaningfully well, relatively quick. The same things that made one of these packages worth installing now make the package worth replacing. And that's a weird thing that's going to have long-term side effects as we keep changing how we build. This is also a big part of why we're not talking as much about new libraries as we were in the past, because the incentive to bring in something new that the agents might not know about is a lot lower than the incentive to build something the agent does know about because it lives in your code base. And this puts us in a really weird place where I think we're going to see people copy-pasting prompts instead of building actual packages. As NCE just put it in chat, prompts are kind of becoming the new library. I expect we'll see more and more things like this. Matt Pocock posted a few days ago that bad agent MD files can make your coding agent worse and cost you tokens. Here's a prompt you can use to clean it up, plus a full guide for folks that want to learn. This is a prompt you can go to his website, grab, copy, paste into your terminal, and then use to fix things. Here's the prompt. I want you to refactor my agent's MD file to follow progressive disclosure principles. Follow these steps. Find contradiction. Identify any instructions that conflict with each other, yada, yada. You know what? Let's try this. Open a new terminal. Paste, enter. Let's see what it has to say. Contradictions found. None detected. Your instructions are internally consistent. The only potential ambiguity is that I say use PNPM if the project already uses it, otherwise use bun, but it's clear as written. And then essentials. These are things that should stay in the root. Cool. It suggests that maybe my tech stack and TypeScript restrictions should be put out, but they're so simple, I don't think that's necessary. Always strive for concise, simple solutions. That's funny because that I copied from a Matt Pocock thing. Redundant, that's the default behavior. Sure it is, Claude. Sure your default is concise and simple solutions. If a problem can be solved in a simpler way, propose it. Redundant, covered by the above, I don't agree. I found that this edition has actually been very, very nice. If it has to do too much work at once, stop and state that clearly. Too vague, what threshold? Sure. But this is actually useful. And if I had a bigger Claude MD, this would be very, very helpful. In fact, let's ask it in T3 chat to do the same thing. Here it's actually finding some useful stuff, especially comparing and contrasting my global Claude MD with the internal one. Like, this is a useful thing. And now it's asking questions about which things I want to keep track of. That's great. This is, again, valuable. This could have been a library. He could have written a library that I would run that would do a lot of different things, that would make these comparisons, that would run against some agent he's hosting in the cloud and charging money for. But instead, it's a prompt you can copy paste into your code base and see what happens. That's really cool. And I suspect we'll be seeing more and more of these things going on in the future. I think I've said all I have to say here. The world is changing, and in some ways it's scary, but in others it's exciting. How do you feel about this, though? Are you going to go uninstall all your NPM packages, or do you think I'm just blowing smoke up of Claude's ass? Let me know how you feel, and until next time, peace, nerds.